So there's a significant chance of South Africa falling into a recession this year, and this is as the country's electricity crisis deepens. Now, last year, you'll remember that the country experienced 200 days of power cuts, the worst since rolling blackouts started back in 2007. Senior economists say that the risk of South Africa falling into a recession have been intensified by also a lower global growth outlook. Peter Worthington, a senior economist at Absa, joins us this afternoon to break this down even further. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon, Peter. And you would have heard there with the CEO of BLS say there's a lot of frustration when it comes to the power crisis in South Africa and really what it's done to an already fragile economy. Maybe you could give us a sense as to how much of economic growth has this crisis actually shaved off a GDP?
You know, it's an interesting question, and it's one that's hard to answer precisely, but we did some econometric estimates, regression analysis, and came up with a figure which is that for every 1% of electricity demand that we're unable to satisfy because there's no supply, GDP is knocked back by about 0.14%. Now, those are small numbers. But really, we're not supplying a great deal more than 1% of electricity demand. So, for example, if we take 2022 as a whole, we estimate that GDP growth would have been about 1.3 percentage points higher had we had no load shedding. The challenge is, I think, you know, those relationships change a little bit over time. If we look at Q3, for example, up until that point, Q3 was the worst quarter on record for load shedding. And yet, what we actually had was a surprisingly strong GDP growth for Q3. It sort of outperformed all expectations, coming in at about 1.6%. Now, the load shedding has intensified greatly since then. You know, December was the worst month on record for load shedding. And so far, January is already on track to be even worse still. And when we look at some of the indicators of activity that we've had recently, for example, the PMI or maybe the mining production for November that was published today, they're all pointing to some weakness in activity.
I mean, it's very difficult with what you've just explained to us to think of any green shoots that could still exist within the economy. We do have a delegation that is trying to sell South Africa as an investment case, and it's difficult given that the nucleus of the economy is where it's at, and I'll talk about Eskom here. But are there any green shoots at all, Peter, or am I reaching here?
Well, listen, I mean, I think there are some encouraging signs that the reform program is slowly starting to have some effect in some areas. We haven't reached the end destination, as Busi was describing, for the network industry reforms, where we actually have a good operating environment for businesses. But I think, you know, there were some signs that fixed investment spending was picking up a little bit. I agree that maybe it will be dampened to some extent by the ongoing load shedding. But we have to look at the issue of the load shedding that we're having right now and try and make some kind of a judgment call about whether it is, what proportion of this intensified load shedding is due to sabotage, which might be quickly addressed, or is due to sort of an unfortunate clustering of bad luck events all happening at one time, which may be a one-off, or whether it is really something more systemic at Eskom, and we're just, because we have got old plant and accumulation of poor maintenance, that it's going to be very hard to address it. It's probably a mix of all three things, but I guess what I'm trying to say is it may be that we move off of stage 6 load shedding relatively soon and back to lower levels. And if you look at the Q3 outcome that we had pretty intense load shedding then, but we had relatively good overall GDP print. It may be that some parts of the economy, big business in particular, are becoming more immune to the power cuts because they've installed their own sources of power, whether it's a super big generator or whether it's renewables, solar PVs on the roofs of shopping centers and the like. But of course, not every business is going to be able to do that, and particularly small businesses, small retailers, small manufacturers and the like, they're the ones that are going to be hit more hard, I would expect, from persistent power cuts. Yeah, I've seen the sort of the Bloomberg story that 45% of economists are expecting recession next year, and you did touch on it in the beginning. Load shedding is not the only headwind the economy has. We've also got a sort of a significantly more deteriorated global growth outlook. But there are some things that are positive as well, such as lower fuel prices coming through.
Yeah, and let me talk quickly about inflation and the impact that that will have on whether we see a recession or not, and really also just informing the direction that the South African Reserve Bank will take. I mean, we are seeing higher tariffs coming in April from NERSA after that announcement, and a myriad of other issues as South African consumers and small to medium businesses. So the role that inflation you think is going to be it's going to play rather perhaps in the first half of the year, for instance, Peter.
Right. So we actually believe that inflation has peaked. We've already seen it come off its highest point, and we expect to see fairly significant falls in inflation coming through in the first half of 2023 as food and fuel price inflation really abates. And behind that, we're going to have a little bit of further increases coming through in core CPI. And of course, you mentioned the electricity tariff. But we're of the view that the Reserve Bank is really very close to the peak of the hiking cycle. We recently trimmed our own forecast of what they would do in January. We had been anticipating a 50 basis point hike. We now say just 25, because in December we had a couple of below expectations inflation prints, both PPI and CPI. We've had a rand that's been proving reasonably stable. Oil prices have come off, and food too. And globally, the inflation seems to have peaked. So we think we're kind of at the peak here for almost at the peak for interest rates.